switching over to water quality. My job here is to take up the next few minutes and give you all the quick version of the laws here for water quality in the state of Florida. How do we restore these springs? So, real quick, we all understand the problem. The problem is intensity of land use, really, in our spring sheds. Springs are a little bit different than other watersheds. Surface waters, you tend to think of what's flowing off, those sorts of storm events. Those are a little bit easier to quantify and control. With springs, we're dealing with activities that are on the land that get down into the spring system. And we've talked a lot about the fact that over the years, the level of nitrates, nitrogen, that are going into these systems have been increasing, right? So that's the problem. Where are those coming from? This right here is actually Silver Springs, right in the middle, right there. This is Ocala, and some of you who've seen this talk before or seen me up here, what are all these little purple dots? Anybody guess? Farms, those are septic tanks. These are people that have developed. These are septic tanks. This radius up here is a 10-mile radius around the spring. So you're talking tens of thousands of septic tanks. Now, one of the things you have to understand is septic tanks are not meant to reduce nitrogen. All right? They're there to reduce, to help human health and to deal with bacteria, not nitrogen. So all of those are little sources that get into our groundwater. This isn't just an urban problem. Here we go. This is Santa Fe River. This is the Swanee River. We can see this. All these blue dots are springs along those. One of the largest collections in the world. And this is mainly an agricultural landscape. We can see we can actually see center pivots and things like that. So it's a really diverse in how we're going to help restore these springs. We have some springs that are driven by urban issues. We have other springs that are driven by agricultural issues. And then we have a few that are kind of both. All right. So here's the framework in the state of Florida, and this actually mimics the Clean Water Act of how we are supposed to protect and restore our springs. Number one, we've got to set water quality standards. We've all talked about that. Bob mentioned it before, the 0.35 nitrate that was set a few years ago as the standard for what's coming out of the spring. That will actually allow the spring to be productive. Oh, goodness, pressed the wrong button. Next, one of the things we have to do is we have to collect information about those. We have to see what springs have problems, which ones don't. This is that monitoring and assessment part of the process. And then for the ones that have problems, we have to improve them. In Florida, those are through what are known as total maximum daily loads, TMDLs. You've heard those words before. But that's really how we restore springs in Florida. We know what it should be, this water quality standard, but how do we get it back to meeting that water quality standard? That is what a TMDL is. And then in Florida's unique, we have these Basin Management Action Plans, or BMAPs, which are the blueprints to getting those systems restored. And there's a few components to these BMAPs. And BMAPs are unique to Florida. If you go to any other state, you will not find BMAPs there. All right? They do everything through what they just say is TMDLs, which is really just looking at dischargers. All right? So this idea of non-point source, dealing with agriculture, dealing with septic tanks, dealing with any of the things that we would consider stormwater as non-point source, that's not really in the discussion in other states. In Florida it is through this BMAP process. And this came into effect in 1999, so it's relatively young, and there's and it's amended in 2006. BMAPs started in 2006. That was when that legislation got put in place. So that's important to understand. We haven't been at this for decades, restoring our springs, going through this problem. We've seen the problem, and I think people became aware of this in the 90s and 2000s. But however, how we are going to restore those, especially with water quality, came into effect really in the mid-2000s. And so why is that important? Because restoration for many water bodies takes decades. It's the way it goes. Tampa Bay estuary, if you look at that, that was one that just 2 years ago just met its seagrass targets. It's one of the national leaders for restoration and showing success stories. That was over 2 to 3 decades in development. They started working on point sources in the 80s. They started working on non-point sources really in the mid-90s. And 2 years ago it met its target, which was seagrass back to the 1950s. So it can be done. It's consistent, concerted efforts that go there. The way that BMAPs and the way the whole Watershed Restoration Act is set up in Florida is basically these 3 principles here. Number 1, good science. We have to have science and information. And I know that's been a discussion point quite a bit here of how much for us to be able to move forward. Public participation, I think, is one of the biggest ones. All of our activities, from assessing water bodies to developing TMDLs to doing BMAPs, have to be done in the public. We have public meetings. We get input from all stakeholders. It's a key component to what we do. And then this idea of equitable allocations. As I was talking about, basically what that means is you're responsible for what you're responsible for, all right? So that means if there's sources out there, whether it be from septic tanks or from agriculture, they have to go through and do and take care of what they're responsible for. You can't keep it onto another source. Updates occurred this past year to both this Watershed Restoration Act and also specifically for springs. So the legislature identified outstanding Florida springs. We've seen where all these are. Basically, there's 31 outstanding Florida springs around the state that the legislature wants us to focus on. 24 of those springs are not meeting their water quality standards, so we have to do something about those. The law requires us to do a number of things. One is, we've talked about contribution area, but within that contribution area, there's some areas that more affect the spring than other areas. These are, geologically speaking, the most, that affect the groundwater. What happens on the land affects the groundwater the most. That is the priority focus areas. Then we also have to identify these sources, the various sources that I talked about, to figure out who needs to do what and how much of it, to look at trying to restore this system. Important to note in here that septic tanks were one that were called out as part of the springs legislation. And they basically said that in areas where septic tanks are a significant contributor, the state has to come up with this remediation plan to deal with it. Again, that has to be done through a very public process. The most important thing, and you're going to hear this from the other groups, and I think I stress this, is the fact that really what BMAPs come is the projects in order to get them done. So, you can put together a plan, you can put that plan on the shelf, but it's really the actions. And actions in BMAPs are the actual projects. This is who's going to be out there putting the grant programs in place to get septic tanks converted. What programs are going to get them put onto sewer? What are the programs that the Water Management District will be talking about? Those cost share programs dealing with agriculture. How are they going to interact with them and actually put those various efforts into place, into practice, so we can actually meet our goal. And lastly, I just want to point out financial assistance and the fact that the legislature has put their money where their mouth is. As many of you know, they've carved out $50 million a year for the next 20 years for the restoration of springs. And that $50 million goes to capital projects that will restore either the water quality, so reduce nutrients going to the spring system, or restore the flow for the springs. So again, it ties back to these specific projects of how are we going to get there. And I'm over my time, but I thank you.